What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I am your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by a good friend of mine and a hardcore Giants fan, Jordan Teigman. What's going on, bud? How you doing?
Hey, Khaled, how's it going? Happy to be here.
It's going well, man. So today's episode is about the top 3 biggest what ifs in New York Giants history. So Jordan and I will be going through our top 3. We tried not to overlap. There's going to be a little bit of overlap with some of them just because, there's some big moments in recent Giants history. But we'll be talking about these what ifs. We'll try to stick to kind of 50-50 coin flip type situations, and we'll talk about what the potential impact would have been had things gone the other way. So before we jump into the what ifs, Jordan, why don't you tell me why you became a Giants fan in the first place?
Yeah, to me, I was kind of like born into it. Come from a family that my dad, my grandpa, they've been going to game. My grandpa's been going to games since the 70s. My dad telling me stories about Lawrence Taylor. That was actually the first jersey I ever owned. I had like a baby size Lawrence Taylor jersey. My dad was at the NFC Championship against Washington in '86. My grandfather and dad went to Tampa for the Super Bowl in
Wow. Okay.
2000. And actually, in Eli's first season as a Giant in '04, we got season tickets. So I'm 27, '04. I was 8. So I've had season tickets for almost 20 years now. And I could probably count on one hand how many home games I've missed. And on road games, it was always a big family event. So very well versed on the history of the New York Giants, well versed
Okay.
on the franchise, and when approached about talking about it, happy to discuss and looking forward.
For sure. I love stories like that, man. It's just like when the fanhood it's not really a choice. It's just like a bloodline thing. Like it got passed down from your dad and his dad. And, you guys probably been fans of the team for as long as they've been around. I think they've been around, I don't know, 100 years now or something. So
Yeah,
you've got all the years covered. Yeah. For me, it was, I just picked my team because I happened to be in the Bay Area and the Raiders were good when I was a kid. So no bloodline, no nothing. Just
right.
picking the best team with the cool colors when I was, in 8th grade or something. So thanks for the background. Let's jump right in. So we'll go back and forth. We'll go, 1 to 3. So Jordan, why don't you tell me about your number one what if in Giants history?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it when I mentioned when I started season tickets in 2004, and that was Eli's rookie season. So I guess my history with the team and basically my entire life as a fan, especially in my formative years, all I knew was Eli as a quarterback. But if you go back in history and you look back at kind of how Eli became a Giant, he was the top rated prospect out of Ole Miss. Everyone knew he was going to be the number one pick. And the San Diego Chargers actually had the number one pick at the time. And his dad, Archie, kind of like was shoving him in the direction of, you're not going to San Diego. You're playing anywhere else. Peyton at the time was already becoming, who Peyton Manning ended up being. And, for Eli to make a name for himself, they were kind of pushing him to New York in a way. And the Giants were picking number 4 in that draft. And they, as some of you may know or may not know, that '04 draft was loaded with QB talent, right? You got Eli, you got Phil Rivers, and you got Big Ben, all of whom presumably will be in the Hall of Fame at some point soon. But the Giants had number 4 and picked Philip Rivers, but then traded Rivers for Eli. So, as we all know, his history kind of unfolded. They traded. Eli became a Giant, won 2 rings. Philip Rivers put up great stats, Hall of Fame stats, but never won the big one. So, I would say the biggest what if is, what if Eli never became a Giant?
Yeah.
And what if he was never in New York, right? Like, can Rivers handle New York the way Eli did? Like, does Eli have rings in San Diego? Does Rivers have rings in New York? Big topic, and
Yeah, for sure.
I guess I'm lucky that Eli was a Giant.
Yeah, I think about this quite a bit actually, because I think they're a good case study in quarterback situation and like quarterback clutchness, if that's a word, just because when I think of Phillip Rivers, I mean, I'm a Raiders fan, so I used to see him twice a year for a long time. He would put up crazy numbers. And I think if you're talking about pure like regular season quarterback, you're probably taking Phil Rivers over Eli Manning just because of the numbers. Some of his years were bonkers, but he was also known for making big mistakes in big moments. Like there's always the trademark, he's down 6 with 2 minutes to go and he throws a game-ending interception kind of thing. Or in the playoffs, he had some choke type moments where they fell short despite being, one of the better teams in the league. Whereas Eli was like, to me, feel like the complete opposite. He had some decent regular seasons, but when it came to like nut crunch time, he was the guy that you wanted because he was going to come up with some crazy play, like the helmet catch, like we'll talk about a little bit later. And he was clutch, which is hard to define, but it's just something that when you see it. So to me, I think Eli does take that to San Diego and they probably win at least one ring, but I don't think Phil Rivers is winning a ring in New York. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that with like River. The reason why I think that Rivers number one is he never really had like the infrastructure of the team in San Diego. Like the Giants, I wouldn't say in the playoff runs they probably won because of Eli, but they got there on a strong run game and a strong defense. Like they could have subbed Rivers in and he probably would have fit in seamlessly. But when it came down to it, like Eli's biggest games were, think about that Super Bowl run, like going into the frozen tundra in Lambeau in '07, or getting hit like 25 times in San Francisco in 11 in the championship game. The throw to Manningham, the throw to Tyree, like, I like you said, I can't imagine Rivers kind of doing that in that game. Like his clutch history, like I think the one big game he played in, although he had a torn ACL in New England in the championship game, like they didn't really stand a chance. So I honestly don't. I think that I agree with you that Eli probably would have won wherever he was, and it just came down to the clutch gene. And I'm not sure that I'd be sitting here as a fan of a team that had 2 rings in my years as a fan if Rivers was the quarterback.
Yeah, and that infrastructure you talked about is a big reason why Archie wanted Eli not to go to San Diego and to go somewhere, because he knew all about going to a losing franchise. I mean, he spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and they were awful back then, so he didn't want his kid to go through the same thing. And the thing with Rivers is he played with some Hall of Fame talents. I would say the skill guys that Rivers played with are light years ahead of anybody that Eli played with. You had LT, who's the other LT, I should say, LaDainian Tomlinson, one of the best running backs of all time. Antonio Gates, one of the best tight ends of all time. Whereas I feel like Eli had like this rotating cast of guys, and there was like different skill guys that he was playing, for each of his Super Bowls. So that's the thing, is like Rivers had the tools at his disposal, and I think there was a couple years where they had top 5 defenses, but he just couldn't capitalize for that same reason. He just doesn't have that same clutch gene that Eli did. So yeah, but Eli, I mean, you put Eli with LaDainian Tomlinson and Antonio Gates, I mean, he's probably putting up numbers too. Maybe he's winning a Super Bowl down there too. So I think that carries over. Anything else on this one?
I mean, no, I feel like both of them will go to the Hall of Fame eventually. Eli's case would be a lot harder to make without the rings, right? Just because, like you said, like Rivers put up video game numbers, and Eli's were not strong, but comes down to the clutch gene, and that's really what defines quarterbacks then, but what defines them now, right? Like you're looking at the AFC this year, even like there's a bunch of contending teams, but at the end of the day, Mahomes is going to be there because he's that guy. Like Brady's that guy. Like you got to put Eli in that conversation. He's the guy you didn't want to face in big time games.
Exactly. And he did it twice. Right. And you can't tell the story of the NFL in the 2000s without Eli and those 2 rings. So I do think he gets in. I think Phil Rivers might have a harder case because he doesn't really have that playoff success. And you alluded to the one big game he had against, I think it was Indianapolis. It was the Michael Turner game. I think he rushed for like 200 yards or something. So I don't know. I'm not sure on Rivers. I think 100% Eli gets in, but Rivers, we'll see.
Yeah.
So my number one is a little further back. So this is referring to the Giants era in the 1990s when they were under Bill Parcells. So my question is, what if Bill Belichick ended up being the successor to Bill Parcells in 1991 instead of, kind of going to Cleveland and then going to New England, and the Giants were pretty bad in the early 90s, after that Parcells era. So, after that, they won the Super Bowl in 1990, Bill Parcells left, and the GM at the time, George Young, didn't really like Bill Belichick. He kind of thought he was a little weird and he cussed too much, which is true. He's a weird guy who probably cusses a lot. But eventually they named someone else as the successor to Bill Parcells, and they go through some lean years while Bill Belichick goes on to, lead one of the greatest dynasties of all time in New England. So my what if is, what do you think happens if Bill Belichick ends up in New York? Does he stay there long enough to, be able to build up another dynasty? And is he the same type of, all-time great GOAT level coach in New York?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that question kind of comes down to, like we were talking before with Eli and Rivers, like it comes down to personality. Like, I know you're from the Bay Area, but I'm sure you're familiar with what it takes in a big market being in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think there's something to the fact that Belichick thrived in New England. Like, although it is Boston, it's kind of like when they took over, the Pats were kind of like second or third fiddle to the Sox and to the Celtics, and he
Maybe
kind of
even
was
the
able to.
Bruins, they might have been fourth fiddle in that
Yeah,
town at that time
it
at
could
least.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like he was kind of able to create this dynasty, at least in the formative years, like a little more quietly. Like, to make it in New York, you got to be a certain type of player, certain type of coach. You got to be able to take a lot. He lasted about 3 days in New York. I think even less,
With
like
the Jets,
24
yeah,
hours.
right?
Yeah, with that famous situation with the Jets. And from what we've seen through the last, I guess, 25 years with Belichick, he's definitely not exactly the friendliest guy with the media. Doesn't have the most patience in the world. And to make it here, you really got to be a man of the people. Like, even like recent, like just looking at Dayball, like he's just like a friendly teddy bear. Like, media loves him, and I want to say he's been successful in New York because last year was great. This year is kind of like a mini
He had like the year
disaster. But I
from
think,
hell, yeah.
yeah, I think he'll survive it. But for Belichick, I think he doesn't have the brashness, the personality that a Parcells had or a Coughlin had, where he kind of lays down the law. He's like more mild mannered a little bit, or to himself, and I think that would have, he thrived as a defensive coordinator, and the guys like Banks and Carson and LT, they all loved him. But the head coach is a different animal than the defensive coordinator, and I think it would have kind of mixed it up if he started as a head coach, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, not sure it would have became a dynasty in New York, but then definitely probably would not have. Robert Kraft would not have seen anything in him to hire him for the Patriots, and the dynasty that we know of as the Patriots would have been.
Yeah, yeah. I think the key point that you brought up was the personality. I think that I don't know if the New York media would have given him the time to build things up in New York the way that he got time in New England. Because, like we said, I mean, the Patriots now, they're elite franchise, all the stuff, 6 rings. But back then, third, maybe fourth fiddle. People didn't really care about the Pats. I want to say they were going to move to Hartford at some point, or they were going to move somewhere else. So it got to the point where people just, because they never won, people didn't care about the Patriots. So they kind of flew under the radar, even though they were in this, one of the biggest media markets in the country. So I don't know if he gets the same patience in New York, but I do think what I feel he did in New England was kind of take that Bill Parcells identity and those Giants teams of being super tough and disciplined and defense focused. I think all of that would have carried on, and you would have just been able to continue that in New York. And then obviously the question mark is if he gets the quarterback that he needs. So that's the
Right.
kind of what if on top of the other what if is if he gets the quarterback that he needed, then yeah, I think he's successful in New York, or really successful in New York. But even without that, I think he would have been competitive at least, just because he's just a defensive genius, and that part, at least on that side of the ball, would have been taken care of. But obviously, he doesn't get Brady, so he's not
Yeah,
maybe
the
not the
the
GOAT
narrative's
coach,
kind of
but
shift on him, right? Because
yeah.
you're looking at the Pats now. The whole thing was like, were they a dynasty? Was Belichick great because of Brady, or was Brady great because of Belichick? Right? Like you have, I know this isn't a Patriots podcast, but you
Hmm.
have that one season where Brady blows out his knee and Matt Castle takes them to 11-5, and you're like, all right, Belichick's a genius. Like it's all the system.
Hmm.
But Brady leaves to Tampa. The Pats haven't made the playoffs since, and it's kind of all unraveling. Like I even saw reports that Belichick's leaving and going to the Chargers next year or something like
Oh
that.
wow.
So the story for Belichick, I feel like the end of his career is going to be like, was he great because of Brady? And I guess we'll never know. Like that's a great what if. We'll
Hmm.
never know.
Yeah, and actually, we plan to cover that at some point. Me and my co-host, we're gonna do a "Death of the Patriot Way" podcast, just because, for better or worse, it's over. The Patriot Way,
Yeah,
as we know
for
it,
sure.
it's ending. In New England, if Bill Belichick leaves, and it's ended in Oakland or in Las Vegas because Josh McDaniels got fired. He's probably never gonna get another job. So yeah, it's an interesting what if that you can dig deep, and there's a lot of layers about who was ultimately responsible for what. I think just like my elevator, pitch about it is it was symbiotic. One was great because the other was great, and they just kind
Yeah,
of pushed each other to greatness. And they ended up breaking up because they couldn't sustain the relationship much longer. But I think they pushed each other to greatness
for
essentially.
sure.
So, what is your number two? What if
Yeah,
in
so
Giants
so
history?
number two, staying in that same era that number one was. So '07, everyone knows the 18-1, the biggest Super Bowl upset of all time. Giants are defending champs, and in '08 they come out of the gates blazing hot. They're 10-1, and I remember exactly where I was. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and the day before a massive game against Philly, I believe it was. News comes out that Plaxico Burress shot himself, and he's injured. But not only is he injured, he went to jail for
Hmm.
2 years. And Plax was the guy on the '07 team on offense. Like that game against Green Bay in the NFC Championship was probably the best game I've ever seen any Giant receiver play. Literally tore up Al Harris. And they're 10-1. He's having an awesome back-to-back year, and all of a sudden, shoots himself. The Giants stumble. They eventually got the 1 seed just because of their hot start, but they got a bye. They have a home game against the Eagles, who they're arguably their biggest rival, and McNabb does the moonwalk after he scored, and they lose, and then I don't think they made the playoffs again after that season until the 11th season where when they
Hmm.
won the Super Bowl. So there's a bunch of kind of ripple effects from that. Like number one, they were 10-1. Like who's to say they're not going to repeat, right? They definitely thought they would beat, and Coughlin's even on record saying that was the best team that he ever coached. And he won 2 rings, and he had that Jacksonville team that made the NFC Championship. But he said the '08 Giants were the best team he ever coached. Um, I look back actually, and they beat all 4 of the teams that made the conference championship that year. They
Oh
beat
wow.
Pittsburgh, they beat Baltimore, they beat Arizona, and they beat Philly with plaques. And then you think about like, what are the resumes of all these guys? If they win in '07, they win in '08, and they win in '11, right? Like, does Justin Tuck become a Hall of Famer? Does OC become a Hall of Famer? Like, those guys now have 3 rings. They anchored the defense. Like Antonio Pierce, right? He's in the news now because of what he's doing as a coach, but he was the captain of the defense in '07. He could have been a 2-time champ. Um, Coughlin's no doubt Hall of Famer. To me, it's insane that he's not already in on his 2, but then with his 3rd ring, he's a no doubter. Eli's a no doubter. Like that '08 season could be major.
Hmm.
And we just spoke about the Patriots and their dynasty. Like, how
Yeah.
could you not talk about the Giants as a dynasty if there's 3 rings in 5 years? Like, that's almost unheard of in football these days.
That's a
Um,
dynasty. Yeah.
that's for sure a dynasty. So the ripple effect of that one incident, I think it's easy to pinpoint that that's a major turning point in Giants history.
Yeah, I think I don't remember exactly. I don't remember where I was or anything like that. I do remember hearing the story that for some reason he was in a club with the gun tucked into the waistband of his sweatpants. It wasn't even like in a holster or something, and it slipped out and shot him. And you mentioned Antonio Pierce. Apparently, I didn't know this until like last week, but I guess Antonio Pierce drove him to the hospital
Yeah,
and hid
yeah,
the and
I
hid the
remember
gun
that.
for him. So he's a
Yeah,
true like ride or die guy. Makes me like him more, to be honest. But yeah, I think the ripple effects were clear. You pointed them all out. I do think if they do have Plaxico, they do have a good shot at repeating. I know people say it's hard to defend the title, but I think there's also the motivation of wanting to prove it's not a fluke, because I think the year before they were like what 9-7, and they get
yeah, they
into the
stumbled
playoffs.
in like the last wild card, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So they have the confidence of, all right, we did this before. We want to prove everybody wrong who said it was a fluke, and we're going to do it again. And you talked about Coughlin and Eli being Hall of Famers, but I think maybe Plaxico Burress too. I mean, you look at his resume, you're like, all right, 8,500 yards, a Super Bowl ring, but he shot himself when he was 31.
Yeah,
So, maybe he has 3-4 years at the top without this, the legal issues and all this stuff. So I think it's a pretty clear what if that I think they do become the favorites that year, or they continue to be the favorites that year if Plaxico's not hurt. And I think his career, of course, ends up very differently, and maybe he's in the Hall of Fame. I do think Coughlin is going to get in. I usually, if you have 2 Super Bowls as a head coach, they don't keep you out. Maybe they make you wait a while. Like I think Tom Flores, they made him wait for a long time, but for the most part, if you have two, they usually get you in. And we talked about Eli; he's probably going to get in too. So
yeah.
that's a great one. Anything else on this one?
Um, I mean, not to me. Wish it never. All these things I wish never happened. But I love the fact of wondering what if, because I feel like every fan of every team feels like their teams are cursed. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's just a right of being a sports fan. Like I could go on and on about like why my teams are cursed, but I remember specifically being like feeling like the Giants got robbed of another opportunity to go for it, and
Mm-hmm.
sitting here all these years later, they haven't been they haven't been good for
Yeah.
the last 10 years plus, and would have been nice to have a third ring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just because one guy made a stupid decision, don't know the ripple effects of that.
Yeah,
So my number two is kind of related to Plaxico, and again, we'll stay in that era as well. And it's what if David Tyree doesn't make the helmet catch? So let's set the stage here. The Patriots are 18-0. They're in this Super Bowl against the wild card Giants, who have not a great defense during the regular season, but all of a sudden it becomes like the 85 Bears with that D line and everything. And they're driving late against the Patriots. They're down 14-10. There's about a minute and 15 left in the game. The Giants have 3rd and 5 or 3rd and 6 or something from midfield. We all know the play. Eli drops back. He looks like he's sacked. He pops out of nowhere, throws up a prayer. And David Tyree, who I read, I think had like 3 catches or something, maybe some really small number. I'm gonna pull it up real quick, but let's see. He had in the regular season he had 4 catches for 35 yards, and
yeah,
in this game, just like we've seen many times before, guys become heroes in the Super Bowl, and he catches the first touchdown, and then he makes this helmet catch, which ends up setting up that Plexico Burress touchdown in the corner of the end zone. The Giants win 17-14, and that's the first Super Bowl for Eli Manning. And I think the big what if is if David Tyree doesn't make that catch, they still have 4th down, but obviously, 4th and 15 or whatever it was, because he was going to get sacked for quite a few yards, is really different than 3rd and 5. So I think if he doesn't make that catch, they're not winning the Super Bowl that year. And I don't think they win the second Super Bowl a few years later, because they're facing the same opponent. And in their minds, it makes it real easy. They're like, we kicked these guys' ass before when they were 18-0. We could do it again when they're, not quite as good. So I think without that catch, we don't get the first Super Bowl and we don't get the second Super Bowl. And obviously everyone's legacy is very different coming out of this game. What do you think?
yeah. So before I get into that, there's actually a great story about Tyree specifically in the build up to that game. So
Please, please.
I remember reading about this. It was like Wednesday in the practice before the Super Bowl in Arizona, and Tyree literally couldn't catch a ball. Like he was having the worst practice of his life. And Eli went over to him and said, you got to be ready. Like Sunday's your day. Like it's going to be your day. And not only did he make the helmet catch, he also had the only other touchdown in that game.
Hmm.
So that's just back to Eli for a little bit. Like that's just the type of leader that he was. Like he wasn't the bolsterous guy who was going to make some crazy comments in the media. He was always mild mannered, but his teammates loved him and respected him because he was a leader. And that really, if we're talking what if Eli never did that? Like, does
Mm.
Tyree have the confidence to show up on Sunday and make those plays and do that?
After
You
his
know,
3 catches in the regular
yeah,
season.
he,
Yeah.
he was a nobody. Like, obviously, I'm a diehard fan. I barely knew David Tyree. Um, Became a legend. I remember watching the game and like essentially accepting the fact that Eli got sacked and it was over, and being proud of the fact that they fought that whole game because the Patriots were a juggernaut. But like, all right, we tried, didn't make it, and then I see him getting out of the grasp. Like that's got to be the best viewing moment of my sporting life. But in terms of like the what if, so of course all the things you said, but on a bigger scale, like we're never talking about the 72 Dolphins anymore. Like
Yeah.
Patriots,
That's true.
Patriots
Yeah.
are 19-0. Like that to me is the biggest one. Like with 100% certainty, I can say that if Tyree does not make that catch, that game is over. Pats are 19-0. Everyone's talking about it. And I don't know if I can agree with the 11 part because I think the teams were a little bit different
Hmm.
back, 7 versus 11, at least on the Giants front. But still, the one ring with Eli and Coughlin, even like what we've been talking about, the theme, like about the resume and Hall of Fame. I don't think they get there with one. Like the
No.
difference between
Yeah.
1 and 2 is major. So, it's not hyperbole to say that the catch changed the direction of people's entire career.
Yeah. The legacy, NFL legacy, like with the Patriots, like you said, 19-0, no more 72 Dolphins. And as a Patriots hater, I was rooting very, very hard for the Giants in that moment. I do remember watching that play. I remember the play before. He almost threw the interception to Asante Samuel on the sideline.
Yep.
And, it was just such a insane playoff Super Bowl moment where, it's one of those things, people call it one of the greatest plays in Super Bowl history. I think there's a lot of competition for that, but it's probably the greatest catch in Super Bowl history. I think we could
Yeah.
say, just because how unlikely it was, how difficult it was. And I
And who it
remember
was, right? Like the
exactly.
whole thing is that
Yeah.
like all I wish is that if I wasn't 12 years old, I definitely would have had Giants money line like plus 1,000 in that game. Just as a fan, I feel like it's my duty to take them. But
Were they double digit dogs in that one?
they were 14 and a half points. That the spread was 14 and a half.
Wow. Okay.
Um, so I probably would have put a few bucks on the money line and pray for it. But
I
again,
mean,
I
it's
was
like
12.
it kind of came full circle because the Patriots, I remember, I mean, I was a kid back then, but in their first Super Bowl in '01 or whatever, they were 13 or 14 point dogs to the Rams, and of
Yeah.
course ended up winning. So yeah, it's crazy. Sometimes, yeah, these things come full circle, and they got punched in the mouth just like they punched the Rams in the mouth. So yeah, if he doesn't make that catch, we're having a very different conversation about Eli and Tom, even if they do win that other Super Bowl. Because one Super Bowl is like, okay, sure, maybe you caught lightning in a bottle, you caught some breaks, things went your way, you still won it, which is great, kudos to you, but it's not like a legacy thing versus winning 2. It's like you did it once, like I'm going to do it again, and you prove that you are among the elite of all time. So
Yeah, for
that's a
sure.
big one. Yeah. So what is your number 3?
So my number 3, we keep going to this '07 team, and I felt like consistent going with that era because that is really a monster year in Giants history, and at least for me as a fan, dating back, I don't date as far back, like born in '96, so I was 4 years old when they lost in the Super Bowl in 2000. But these '07, '11 teams were really when I started like really knowing what was going on and knowing how to follow the sport. And looking back, there were a lot of stuff that you could take from that. And what I remember was in week 17, actually, of the 2007 season, the Giants hosted the Patriots, who were 15-0 at the time, it used to be 16 games. So they were
Yep.
15-0 the last week of
I
the
remember
season.
that very clearly. Yeah.
And the Giants in week 16, they demolished Buffalo in Buffalo and they clinched a wild card spot. So the conversation leading up to that week was, all right, rest the starters. They were playing Tampa in the wild card game, like play the backups, get everyone healthy. And Coughlin was like, nah, man, screw that. We're going
Hmm.
full throttle, playing everyone 4 quarters,
Yeah.
and we're going to see how we measure up. And they absolutely blitzed them in the first half. I think they were winning by like 14 or something.
Hmm.
And then Randy Moss ended up, I remember he had a breakaway touchdown on Jabril Wilson. And the Pats ended up winning 38-35 in an epic game. That meant literally nothing for the Giants. But for me, why I think that that's a what if that changed everything, because that was kind of like the buildup for that '07 game that we keep talking about. Like,
Hmm.
they knew we can measure up with these guys. We can play with them. Like, and if Coughlin never plays the starters in that game, right, he could have easily just taken the route of let's rest them. You never have that ability. They have the tape now. Like, they had a lot of stuff that was allowing them to build momentum into the Super Bowl and know that even though on paper these guys are giant, like quote unquote giants, and
Yeah.
they're beasts. Um, we can still play with them and maybe even beat them. So who knows what happens if they don't have that game plan from the Week 17 game, if they went the conventional route and just rested the starters. So I think that that's a massive point.
Has that like colored your opinion on this forever? Like you have to play your starters in even if it's a meaningless game?
I think as a football fan, not even a Giants fan, like if you look at history, I feel like the success rate of those who rest their player, like we speak Patriots a lot,
Hmm.
that Brady never rested, even if it's one half. Always played that one half in that meaningless Week 17 game. Um,
They had a
the
lot of
flip
those.
side of that '08 run were the Cowboys. They were the 1 seed, and famously you had Romo on vacation with Jessica Simpson, and he's vacationing, missing wild card week, and then all of a sudden they lose. Right? There are so many more examples of not showing up in those games because you're not fresh. Like, especially at the end of the season, like everyone's bumped, everyone's bruised. Like, it kind of sinks in more if you're resting, like instead of
Hmm.
going full throttle. So I'm always of the opinion, like, granted, I haven't really had that as a fan of the Giants recently, where they have the debate whether or not to rest. But if they did, I always err on the side of play them even if for a little bit, keep them going, keep the momentum going.
Yeah.
Because the flip side is the alternative is doesn't seem like it works.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I think it's more a mental thing than a physical thing because you always want that bye week. But during that bye week, in the playoffs, you're not thinking, oh, we should be playing right now, but I'm going to take it easy. It's like, no, like we kicked everybody's ass. We earned this. So we're going to stay sharp, stay focused, all that. But if you are coming into that week 16, 17, 18 game, whatever, and it's meaningless, unless you're carrying some kind of like injury risk or something, I think you should play at least a half and just stay mentally sharp. I think more than physically sharp, which is, we saw it play out here. Uh, and yeah, I do think it's a pretty clear what if he doesn't do that, if he does rest his starters or doesn't play the whole game, I don't think they beat them in the Super Bowl because they don't have that mental edge. And I'm sure all the 2 weeks leading up to the game, I'm sure Coughlin was probably playing like, here are the 3 or 4 plays that cost us this game, and we could have beat them had these gone our way. We're better than these guys, or we're as good. We don't care about 17-0 or whatever. We're better than these guys, and we can match up with them. And without all that, I think it's pretty clear that they don't win that game. So, anything else here?
No, I think we covered it.
All right. So I feel like I'm the one going back in history a little more than you, but mine is, what if Scott Norwood doesn't miss the famous wide right kick? So this is back in 1991, Super Bowl 25. They're facing the Bills in their first Super Bowl. They have the famous triplets, Jim Kelly and Andre Reed and Thurman Thomas. They have a bunch of Hall of Famers on defense. The Giants have plenty of talent as well. But it basically comes down to about a 45-yard kick, I think. And growing up, I always thought Scott Norwood was like this amazing kicker, and he missed the field goal just because, he couldn't handle the moment. But I read, as part of my research here, is that he was like 1 for 5 on natural grass outside of 40 yards. So it was like, because the Bills used to play on AstroTurf back then. So part of me is like, why didn't they just go for it on fourth down there instead of kicking, a 45, 47-yard field goal, whatever. But essentially, if Scott Norwood does make this kick, then the Bills win the game. Bill Parcells only has 1 ring instead of 2. The Bills, I think they shake off their curse label because you get that 1 Super Bowl, and I think the rest of their history is different. Even leading up to today, we still talk about the Bills being cursed in 13 seconds with the Chiefs, all that stuff. But the big question is, we talked about Tom Coughlin and Eli Manning with 1 ring. What about Bill Parcells? Is he still a Hall of Famer with just 1 ring if Scott Norwood makes that kick?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same exact conversation. Like 1's a fluke, 2 is elite. You've done it. So,
that's a no.
Well, no, the body of work for Parcells is probably a little bit deeper than it is for Coughlin.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's definitely more of an argument than it already, does he then become the legend with the Dolphins, the Patriots, the Cowboys? He definitely has, success everywhere he's gone, but it's more of a conversation for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I still think he gets in. But again, 1 versus 2 is a big deal, right? Brad Johnson and Trent Dilfer each have 1.
There you go. Sean McVay has 1. What other coach? I'm sure there's some other coaches that are like, meh, but they still have a Super Bowl. So, yeah, I mean, I think he probably still gets in just because, like you said, the body of work is deeper and he's a lot more accomplished than some of these other guys with other teams. But I do think the bigger what if is like the Bills becoming maybe a dynasty because they get that first one. And of course, the Giants, they get 1 less Super Bowl, which is a big deal. So I think that was a big one. Do you have any honorable mention types? Anything that just comes to mind or something else you thought of that wasn't good enough for the top 3?
Yeah. So I already heard about not going deep enough in history, and in my defense, in '91, I was still not around. I hear the stories from the lore, and I, those the '80s teams are like built in like what the New York Giants are. Like you watch the highlights, like freezing cold games, LT chasing down guys. The Joe Theismann hit. I've seen that a bunch of times, but I think an honorable mention that's consistent with teams in that '07 to like 13 era that could have gone is if you remember in 2012, so defending the 11 ring, Giants once again were pretty good. And they had a massive divisional game against the Eagles at home where if they won, they would have taken a 1-game lead with 3 games to go in the NFC East. They're up like 35-14. And Vic and Deshaun Jackson just went off in the 4th quarter. Tie game. Giants drop back to punt. Just should be a formality.
This moment, yes.
Overtime. And we got Matt Dodge. Punts it inbounds. You see Coughlin steaming red. Deshaun Jackson takes it to the house. Game over. And essentially season over. And they don't bounce back for another 6 years back to the playoffs. So if yes, of course, it's not Matt Dodge's fault that the Giants blew a 21-point lead in the 4th quarter. But if he kicks that ball out of bounds, at least you got overtime. You got a coin toss. We win the coin toss. Eli's clutch gene. He's driving us down the field. We win that game, and then we got another chance to repeat. So, what if Dodge doesn't punt that ball right to Deshaun Jackson?
That's a great one. So you've given me like 2 Giants fan only nuggets in this pod, like the David Tyree Eli moment in practice. I had no idea about that. And of course I remember this moment because it's replayed a lot with the Deshaun Jackson return during that year. I didn't realize the impact that it had on like the playoff race and all that.
Yeah, end of the season.
Yeah, I remember that era of Giants football being just weird. Like they just, if they weren't the underdogs, if they weren't the wild card team, they would just fall short, whether they're like losing to Green Bay, after the what was it, the boat picture that they
Yep.
took, or like,
Odell couldn't
you
catch
know,
anything.
wearing Tim's on a boat for some reason. Yeah, and they just, when they were the favorite, they just kind of fell apart. But they had those two magical runs against the Patriots, which I'm forever grateful for as a Patriots hater. So I appreciate you, man. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your knowledge. You're obviously a hardcore fan. Thank you guys for listening. That's it for the show. Make sure to follow us, leave us a review, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. And make sure to check us out on all the social media channels at 4040 Vision Pod. Any last words, Jordan?
No, thanks for having me. It was a blast, and maybe we could do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Thanks, everybody.